So what exactly are we doing when we are told to write a literature review? So as I've demonstrated here, a literature review is one really important building block of any research article that you will come across. And so I like to use this definition. There's a really fantastic guide. I gave the link here from the University of Toronto, which is essentially trying to demonstrate in a literature review what has been published already by scholars and show what ideas and what areas have been already established on the topics, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, what's still left to be done. And the big key thing that it's not just a list or a set of summaries of every single thing that has been published on that particular topic. So the purpose of a literature review then is broader than just summarizing all the literature. Yes, you are first giving the reader a bit of a landscape of the major debates on the topics, especially looking at where scholars agree, where they disagree, and why. It could be for a variety of reasons, and then showing where your study then will fit into these debates. It also can give the reader a foundation on which you're going to base later on all of your methodological choices. So which concepts are you using? How have some people defined it? How are you going to define it? And how does that differ? What are some of the measures and methods that have been used in the past? Because those are going to influence how you make your choices later on. So what I like to say, and this is the key part to look at, is to approach your literature review with questions in mind. And this key question is, how have other scholars answered the questions you are asking, or similar questions? Are the scholars' answers conditional upon upon the context? So for example, is it based on a situation in the US versus what's going on in Canada? That might be very different, and their findings might not apply to our findings here in Canada. Is it based on the methods that are being used? Maybe one uses interviews, another uses surveys. That could be why the answers are different from different scholars. It could be the types of cases that are being studied. And then think a little bit about whether you have any criticisms about their theoretical and methodological choices, because these choices are going to have an effect on what their responses are, and therefore whether scholars are agreeing upon the answer to your research question or not. Think a bit about what hasn't been studied yet and what questions remain unanswered. So your research should be fitting into that landscape. There should be things that scholars can't really answer everything in one article, right? So you're going to try to find essentially all the pieces of the puzzle that have been filled out, and then where you are adding a unique piece. And then looking at where there are major debates. So there might be some areas where some people agree on something, some people disagree on something. So how is your work going to help address that particular debate? So in summary then, just to really quickly say what a literature review is and what it is not. So it is directly related to your topic and research question. So what we don't want to see here is a random tangents all over about every random thing. We want it to be directly related to your topic. I think that's one of the pitfalls that people fall into, is they'll end up just giving like a giant dump of like, here's all the things I can find on anything tangentially related. No, it needs to be directly related to your research question. It demonstrates what's known and what's not known, identifies key areas of debate or disagreement, and suggests area for future research. Here are some things to look out for and not to do. So again, you do not need to provide a history of your topic or a complete background. So, there might be some key terms you want to define. There might be some very short sentences on background you want to give, but this is not the place to be giving, 5 pages about the history of elections in Canada. Not your place. Be very focused. Again, likewise, don't get into tangents. There can be really interesting debates that exist out there, but make sure you focus on, this is my research question, and if this doesn't help me address that research question and the debate related to that research question, get it out of there. There are times I'll write a literature review and there'll be paragraphs that have to get cut because I find that they really aren't contributing to the article. Again, don't provide just a list of everything ever written on your topic. like a listing or a paragraph by paragraph, this person did this, and then this person did this, and then this person did this. We're not really looking for something chronological. We're looking for something that is highlighting the major debates that exist in the field. And don't only cherry pick studies that prove your point. Here's the really good place where you can say, some people say this, others people say this. Well, we're going to try to contribute to that. So don't just try to show all of the articles that agree with you. And so to make this a little more concrete, I'm going to show a really recent article that's just come out that I wrote with a colleague. And I'm going to go step by step through the literature review that I wrote and show you kind of what was going on in my mind, what I was planning to do, and how I contributed to the debate through this literature review. Okay, so we'll just skip over the abstract and the introduction a little bit. So essentially, the paper was interested in the relationship between polling locations and turnout, essentially. So yeah, is distance to the polling location related to turnout? So the first piece was a little bit more descriptive, and then the independent variable being how far somebody is to their polling station. Does that relate to whether they're going to go vote or not? Okay, so that's what we're really interested in. So here's my literature review. Again, I titled it Distance to Polling Locations and Voter Turnout. So what I'm doing at the beginning is I'm kind of broadening it up to some of the major issues that we're talking about. And one of those major issues is whether somebody goes to vote or not, so voter turnout. So the theory that I'm drawing on here is Downs' rational calculus of the costs of voting. So what I say is, there's some theories that help us understand whether somebody votes or not. Some of them have to do with duty. But the one that I'm really looking at is the cost of voting. So the idea being that there can be resource costs, there can be time costs, cognitive costs related to going to vote. And so if you make the costs less, people are going to be more likely to vote. And this is what Downs has talked about. So the idea being that if you make it easier, well, then maybe more people will vote. So right here, I say, well, scholars have considered about the ease of voting might have an impact on turnout. Some solutions have been offered, for example, to reduce and eliminate travel times to the polls. That could include postal voting, where you don't have any time, you have time costs, when you don't have any travel costs involved. Some people have looked at internet voting being an option to reduce travel altogether. Other people have taken a look at a variety of different innovations. And so the thing, though, that we know is that these innovations rarely impact everybody the same. So now this is what I'm doing here is I'm setting up for the fact that later on in this article, we are going to be talking about the fact that the distance to the polls are not necessarily going to be the same for every type of population group, depending on age, depending on wealth, for example, depending on region. And so I'm setting that up by saying, yeah, we've looked at a few different ways that we can decrease the cost of voting, but we know that they are not going to influence people in the same way. So I'm setting that up for later. And then right here, I'm setting up the fact that, okay, but even though you can have all these different innovations to reduce costs, the reality is that a lot of people are voting on election day at a physical polling location. So what do we know about polling locations and how that's going to impact turnout and how it's going to, so I'm really kind of digging in here into this independent variable. So I say, well, we've done some research about polling locations in terms of how they are staffed. We've looked a little bit about issues of accessibility and how that might influence turnout, but then also, the accessibility of polling stations. But that one of the areas that we've looked at, especially in the United States, is the geographical placement of polling stations. So now we're really digging into that independent variable. And so I look at this body of research that has considered distance voters have to go to travel to polling locations and the likelihood of turning out to vote. So what I'm doing here is now I'm going to address those studies that have very directly tried to answer the same research question that I have. But what I'm going to do while I do that is I'm going to say, okay, well, here's where we're kind of missing. So first of all, one thing that I'll note is that a lot of the research is in the United States. So I found a bunch of studies in the States. one French study. I think there was a New Zealand study somewhere, but the reality being that this hasn't been studied in the Canadian context. And so later on, I'm going to explain why I chose the Canadian case, why that's important. But in order to do that, I need to set up here that most of the studies look at the United States. So they're going to vary geographically. I'm also going to show how the studies vary based on how they measure things like distance and how they measure turnout. So in the United States, sometimes you can measure turnout through these things called voter rolls, essentially where it's publicly available information whether somebody voted or not. So you can actually take their address, figure out their specific address, how they got to the polls, or what the distance would be to their polling station, and specifically whether that individual voted. We don't do that in Canada. And so I'm setting up here, here's how we could, how scholars have done this in the United States. But I'm going to later on use this so that I can show here's a different model because we don't have access to these data in Canada. There's also studies that look at like how voters are getting to the polls. So later on in the study, we're going to be looking at public transit. And so later around here, I talk about, well, some of these studies do look at the availability of a car. So there's another innovation. So essentially what I'm doing here is I'm setting up all of these variations in the studies, and that's going to set up why I'm making certain methodological choices in the next section here, where I'm going to be moving on into looking at my methodology. And I'll talk about, well, here's why I chose the case of Canada. Here's why I'm doing this particular method of measuring distance. Here's why I'm looking at public transit in addition to cars. Because I'm trying to demonstrate that there are still gaps that exist in the study of distance and voter turnout. Also later on, I'll be looking a little bit at nonlinear relationships. So the idea that it's not just, you get farther away and it's going to, turnout's going to decrease, that it actually decreases to a point and then just stops decreasing because people are used to traveling super far if they live in a super rural area. And so I say, here's where I find that idea of a nonlinear relationship so that I have that to base it on when I later on am going to be showing a nonlinear relationship in my data. So when I'm going through these studies, I am explaining them, their methodologies, but I'm trying to pinpoint certain reasons why they make certain decisions and how that might influence what their findings are. And so here specifically, I think it's really good that I kind of set up the methodology that we're going to use because we don't necessarily have individual voter turnout data. So I'm trying to show that there is some sort of consensus that in the scholarly literature here that there is a relationship between distance and whether somebody goes out to vote, but that there are some limitations to how we can apply this to the Canadian context. So that's what I'm doing in this literature review. You can see that I start off with a bit of theory. I move into understanding what we really understand about the independent and dependent variable, and then specifically that relationship and then sort of methodological choices that people have made in order to test this relationship, finally setting it up to what I will then add, or what we will then add to the literature itself. So that is an example of a literature review that is a piece of that puzzle of any sort of academic research article. And the reality is it's not, it is definitely always related to the pieces that are going to come after and serves as a building block for that purpose, rather than just a summary of everything that's ever been done before.